All right, everybody. Good morning. Welcome back to PTS. Dan and Lee. How we doing? Dan,
Yahoo.
Lee.
Great.
Yahoo. All right. So let's talk. Let's start a little bit broader first. So sales conversations can be uncomfortable for both parties involved. And if we're really good at what we do, we want that uncomfortableness. We just don't want it to come down to so out of hand that somebody then disengages, because uncomfortableness helps us move forward. One of the pieces that it took me a really long time to get good at was silence. So just dead air, whatever the case may be, no response, no reaction. It's really hard sometimes for salespeople to ask a question and just let it sit until the prospect responds, as an example. They start clarifying. They start, well, what I mean by that is those kinds of things, because they become uncomfortable. So, Dan, why don't you kick us off? Start off with the power that brings and how to incorporate that into the sales process.
It's one of my pet peeves when someone is interviewing someone else. They ask them a question and then they go into a couple sentences explaining why they asked that question. And by then the question's useless. So ask a question and just get quiet. Will you please? It just makes life so much easier. But I think it's also appropriate to be quiet when people ask us a question, because silence evokes power, and in a good way, not trying to be manipulative. So, John, if you and I were talking and you said to me, "Hey, Dan, I need a quote from you," I could say, "Well, why do you need that?" Right? Or you could say, "Hey, Dan, I need a quote from you." Well, why do you need that?
Yeah.
See, even in this, you could tell the difference.
Subtle, but big.
Big. So that's what I would say. I'm interested to hear what Lee has to say about it.
Was that awkward?
The funny part in this setting, Lee, the funny part is you usually get people going, I'm sorry, can you hear me? Did we lose you? That kind of stuff. Yeah.
I think a lot of this goes back to what we've discussed before about being a really good listener, number one. But I know that's not exactly what we're talking about. And I think some of the things that when you either ask a question or asked a question, when you continue on, you almost give people the answer that you want.
Yes.
So you're not always getting an unvarnished opinion, which I think is difficult. I think the other piece, when someone asks us a question, we so desperately want to be seen as knowledgeable and the expert in the field. And we've all been asked questions that we don't know the answer to, or questions that if we'd rather take a moment to think about it and phrase our answer more appropriately or more strategically, it would benefit us. And so, not just starting to talk as soon as they're done, but, giving it a moment to think about it and then answering can be extraordinarily beneficial for you.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times in the scenario where we ask a prospect a question, we're putting them, if we're asking good questions, we're putting them in a position where we're forcing them to think it through a little bit.
Yep.
And they need a little time. We're not asking yes/no questions. We're asking open-ended realities of what's going on in their world. And sometimes they need a moment with it.
Sure.
And that moment has the salesperson frequently jumping in and, to your point, steering the conversation or clarifying it, or that silence is usually harder on the salesperson than the prospect or the client.
I always liken it to you're taking a 2x4 and smacking the buyer on the head with it. You want to stun them.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. The buyer says to you, "Hey, what makes you different than the company we're using?" Most salespeople jump right in. Well, here's what makes us different. But what if you sat back, gave a couple second silence, and said, maybe nothing, and then just got real quiet?
Yep.
Who's awkward now? Who's feeling the pressure now? It's all on the buyer, not on the seller. And so silence can turn a whole conversation off of you and put the spotlight on them.
Yep. There we go. Frankly, you want to close this out here?
More silence?
No.
I just think it's one of those things that when you use it well, it can be extraordinarily effective. It shouldn't be something that's used in a adversarial kind of challenging way. That feels very aggressive to me. But I think when you use it in a way to gain more information and uh, also to give yourself room to give correct information can be very valuable.
Yippers. Last thing I'll leave is the vast majority of prospects and clients are not accustomed to dealing with any form of silence.
Sure.
All right, everyone. See you again tomorrow.
Have fun.